Blade Runner wasn't just the film that invented cyberpunk cinema. It was a total war between a director and his star, a director and his studio, a studio and its own financial backers, and a cast and crew who showed up each day to be professionally soaked in both rain and contempt. 13 facts. 0 IMDb trivia. Stay for the bonus. It involves a man who refused $400,000 and why that refusal changed everything. Let's burn through it. Number 13. The financiers fired Scott and Dealey by telegram. The day after filming wrapped, the shoot wrapped. The cast went home. The following morning, director Ridley Scott and producer Michael Dealey received a telegram. Not a meeting, not a phone call, a telegram. It stated plainly that the film was vastly over budget, ballooned from $15 million to $30 million, and that as of that moment, their services were no longer required. Tandem Productions, one of the film's 3 financial backers, had been watching the budget spiral throughout the shoot and reached the end of its institutional patience. The telegram was not a negotiating position, it was a dismissal. The collaboration between director and studio, already poisoned by months of creative warfare, terminated via the least personal communication method available in 1982. Scott didn't comply. Without compensation, he continued working with the post-production team, editing, refining, adding the visual layers that remain astonishing 40 years later. He was being paid nothing. He finished the film anyway, not out of loyalty to the studio that had just fired him by telegram, out of the same relentless perfectionism that had gotten him fired in the first place. The movie, completed by a director who had technically been dismissed before post-production ended, went on to permanently alter the visual grammar of science fiction cinema. The telegram is one of the great unintentional comic documents in Hollywood history. That perfectionism, the thing that broke the budget, had been showing its teeth from the very first week of shooting. Number 12. The production was 2 weeks behind schedule after 3 weeks of shooting. Principal photography began March 9, 1981. By the end of week 3, Blade Runner was already 2 weeks behind schedule. Not 2 days, 2 weeks. In 3 weeks. Scott's aesthetic obsession, his compulsive documented need to control every visual element in every frame, was not a creative luxury on this production, it was a siege. The crew worked night shoot after night shoot, drenched repeatedly by the rain machines that gave the film its atmosphere and gave the cast pneumonia-adjacent misery. Scott, a trained painter who communicated primarily through drawings rather than verbal direction, would reject shots that any other director would have taken and moved on from. He dressed sets himself. He adjusted props personally. He held shots until they matched the extraordinarily specific image in his head. The completion bondholders, the financial guarantors who had insured the film against overages, began circling before the production had found its footing. They were not creative partners. They were a threat-shaped presence on the edges of the set, and their increasing involvement as the schedule collapsed progressively stripped Scott of creative control in post-production. The man whose perfectionism built the visual world of the film was eventually thrown out of the editing suite because of it. What happened inside that editing suite was worse than anything that happened on set. Number 11. Scott was thrown out of the editing room. Then strangers wrote the voiceover. The escalating war between Scott and the completion bondholders ended with Scott physically locked out of the editing suite. The producers brought in their own people. They brought in a writer, Roland Kibbe, to assemble narration from multiple sources. Different script drafts, new lines, fragments stitched together in an attempt to impose clarity on a film they considered too ambiguous for mass audiences. When Harrison Ford arrived to record the voiceover, he found a lone man at a typewriter next to the recording booth, still working on the lines Ford was about to read. Ford introduced himself. The man waved him away dismissively, waved off one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and kept typing. When Ford was handed the finished narration, he gagged. He consulted his agent about contractual terms before agreeing to record it under protest. Ford had argued from the beginning that the voiceover was condescending, that a film confident in its visual storytelling had no need to explain itself aloud. He had been overruled throughout. Now he was standing in a booth reading lines written by a stranger, assembled from fragments, designed to solve a problem he never believed existed. His delivery reflects every molecule of that experience. Scott blamed Ford's deliberately flat reading. Ford denied deliberate intent. Both of them are telling the truth about different things. The voiceover was cobbled together from catastrophe. The ending was assembled from outright theft. Number 10. The happy ending used stolen footage from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. The original theatrical release ends with Deckard and Rachel driving into scenic wilderness, mountains, sky, open road. It is tonally incompatible with every frame that precedes it. It was imposed by producer Bud Yorkin over Scott's strenuous objection. And the landscape footage was not shot for Blade Runner. The aerial scenery was taken from Stanley Kubrick's unused outtakes from The Shining, footage shot over the mountains of Oregon during the film's opening sequence. Kubrick had taken so many passes over those mountains that the production had accumulated far more footage than the film required. That surplus was repurposed and dropped onto the end of Blade Runner to provide a happy resolution the studio was convinced audiences needed. Scott's preferred ending, Deckard and Rachel in an elevator, destination uncertain, cut to black, was deemed too ambiguous, too bleak, too uncommercial. The studio wanted release. They got a landscape that Kubrick had already discarded. The ending imposed on Blade Runner to make it feel warmer was built from another director's leftovers. Scott removed it entirely in every subsequent cut. The elevator ending survives. Kubrick's mountains went back to the archive where they belong. The battle over the ending was visible to anyone who watched closely. The battle over the film's central identity was never resolved. Number 9. Scott and Ford agreed Deckard was human. Then Scott edited the film to suggest otherwise. Before cameras rolled, Ridley Scott and Harrison Ford had a conversation. They agreed Deckard is human, not a replicant. The drama of the film rests on a human being whose emotional distance mirrors the replicants he hunts, a moral equivalence, not a literal identity. Ford committed to that interpretation and built his performance around it. In post-production, Scott quietly edited the film to make Deckard's status ambiguous, inserting material and structuring sequences that would eventually become the unicorn dream in the 1992 director's cut. Ford felt deceived. They had agreed on something. Then the director used the editing room to do something different without telling him. Rutger Hauer, interestingly, sided with Ford, not because he opposed ambiguity, but because he believed the film's moral force depended on Deckard being definitively human. If both hunter and hunted are the same thing, the stakes collapse. Scott was equally consistent in the opposite direction. He always intended Deckard to be a replicant. The film's central question, what makes something human, demands that the hunter cannot be certain of his own answer. 40 years of the most sustained interpretive debate in science fiction cinema followed. Then in 2023, Ford announced he had always known Deckard was a replicant and had simply chosen to resist it. The man who felt betrayed in 1982 had become, 4 decades later, exactly what he'd claimed Scott secretly made him. The argument about Deckard's identity ran the length of the film's existence. The argument about who should play him ran the length of its development. Number 8, Dustin Hoffman spent months in development before walking out over differences in vision. Harrison Ford is so synonymous with Deckard that the casting feels inevitable. It was not. For months during development, Ridley Scott met extensively with Dustin Hoffman, the most acclaimed American actor of his generation, 2-time Oscar winner, the furthest imaginable thing from a traditional action lead. They discussed the material at length. Hoffman departed, citing differences in vision. The casting documents for Blade Runner read like a roll call of an entire Hollywood generation. Gene Hackman, Sean Connery, Jack Nicholson, Paul Newman, Clint Eastwood, Tommy Lee Jones, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Peter Falk, Nick Nolte, Al Pacino, Burt Reynolds. Screenwriter Hampton Fancher had written the dialogue with Robert Mitchum in mind. Lean, laconic, a film noir-era physical presence that was essentially the inverse of Hoffman's brooding existential weight. Ford was chosen partly on Steven Spielberg's recommendation, mid-shoot on Raiders of the Lost Ark, but when Blade Runner began in March 1981, Raiders hadn't even been released. Ford was Star Wars and Empire. He had never carried a film without science fiction scaffolding around him. The studios were skeptical. Scott fought to cast him. What no one predicted was that Ford's particular gift, playing men who are professionally capable and privately hollowed out, would give Deckard precisely the quality the film needed. Not Mitchum's cool, not Hoffman's intensity, something quiet, exhausted, and corroded. The man inside the story was unproven. The man who designed the world around him needed no proof from anyone. Number 7. Sid Mead was hired to design 5 vehicles. He ended up designing the entire future. Sid Mead was not hired as a production designer. He was hired to design vehicles, 5 or 6 types, including the spinner flying car. A specific, contained assignment. He was a celebrated industrial designer whose clients included Ford, Chrysler, Phillips, and United States Steel. Not a filmmaker, not a world builder, a man who designed objects. He began producing background drawings to give his vehicle concepts visual context. To show the spinner in its environment, he had to imagine the environment. Those context drawings caught Scott's attention. The assignment expanded, then expanded again. By the time shooting began, Mead had become the visual architect of an entire future city. The neon advertising signs in their distinctive cartouche shapes, the street-level atmosphere of layered decay, the principle Scott defined as retrofitting, where the future doesn't replace the past but accumulates on top of it like geological sediment. Mead was not a member of any design guild and couldn't be credited conventionally. The production invented a title for him, visual futurist. That credit tells you everything. The job didn't have a name before me did it. The visual language that every cyberpunk film, series, video game, and architectural concept of the following 4 decades borrowed from existed because an industrial designer showed up to do 5 vehicle sketches and couldn't stop. The man who designed the world arrived by accident. The man who wrote the film's greatest speech arrived with a razor. Number 6. The most famous speech in science fiction history was rewritten the night before filming. The Tears and Rain speech. 42 words, 50 seconds. Mark Rowlands called it perhaps the most moving death soliloquy in cinematic history. DeepMind Chief Executive Officer Demis Hassabis named it the recording he'd most want on a desert island. When David Bowie's half-brother died, Bowie paraphrased it in the note attached to the funeral flowers. The version in David Peoples' screenplay was substantially longer, nearly half a page of dialogue that Rutger Hauer found overwritten, tonally inconsistent, and incompatible with the dying cadence of a replicant measuring his final breaths. He called it opera talk. The night before the scene was scheduled to film, Hauer rewrote it himself. He kept 2 technical images, the attack ships, the C-beams, and stripped everything else. The only phrase he added from nothing was the final one, like tears and rain. He told Scott the morning of filming. Scott listened. Then Scott filmed it. When the scene wrapped, crew members who had spent weeks soaked in that cold rain on short sleep and professional frustration reportedly wept. On a set defined by friction and mutual grievance, something had happened that everyone in the room recognized as irreducible. Hauer was characteristically self-deprecating about it. All he did in Blade Runner was so little. But that little thing, 11 words written in a hotel room the night before the camera rolled, is what the film ultimately means. It's what the film is for. The scene that made Blade Runner immortal was written after dark. The experience of making the film was equally nocturnal, in all the worst ways. Number 5. Harrison Ford called the experience a bitch. Publicly, repeatedly. Harrison Ford is professionally circumspect. He does not typically describe his work experiences in terms of personal suffering. He described Blade Runner as a bitch. The word appears in multiple documented accounts and interviews. He was shooting 50-plus night exteriors, repeatedly drenched by rain machines, working under a director whose communication style was almost entirely visual, storyboards, sketches, gestures, and who showed, by Ford's account, limited interest in what his actors needed emotionally to deliver the performances the visual compositions demanded. The specific texture of Ford's unhappiness went beyond conditions. It was structural. He was a first-rank star, Empire Strikes Back the year prior, and found himself on a film where his input was systematically overruled. His performance philosophy was incompatible with his director's, and his central objection about the voiceover was met first with dismissal and then with a recording session under contractual duress. Scott later acknowledged that Ford knew a great deal about the material and was frustrated by being forced to perform against his own professional judgment. That framing reads more like validation than criticism. Sean Young had her own documented ordeal, publicly alleging that Scott's treatment of her shifted after she declined his romantic advances early in the shoot. The atmosphere the film creates, cold, alienated, populated by people who have lost the capacity to feel, was, for significant stretches of production, not only a visual design choice, it was the social weather of the set. The social weather on set was brutal. The critical weather on release was almost as severe. Number 4, Pauline Kael said Ridley Scott should be tested for being a humanoid. Blade Runner opened June 25, 1982, alongside John Carpenter's The Thing. Both were annihilated at the box office by E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which had opened 2 weeks earlier and was already the highest-grossing film ever made. The audience had chosen warmth and wonder over cold and dread. They chose decisively. The critical reception was not merely mixed, it was occasionally savage. Pauline Kael, the most influential film critic in America, wrote that if anyone came along with a test to detect humanoids, Ridley Scott and his associates should hide. Ebert praised the visuals, but found the human story thin. One review coined the phrase "blade crawler." The studio's marketing had positioned the film as an action thriller. Audiences who showed up for action found instead a slow, meditative neo-noir soaked in existential fog. The budget, $30 million. The North American gross, $27,600,000. It did not recoup its production cost from its original domestic run. By every conventional commercial metric of 1982, it was a failure. What no one could calculate was that the video home system and laserdisc market was about to create second lives for films that rewarded repeat, close, solitary viewing and that Blade Runner was perhaps the purest possible example of a film built for exactly that experience. The film the studio buried was found by the audience the studio wasn't watching. The film's title was found in an equally unlikely place. Number 3. The title belongs to William S. Burroughs, and his work has nothing to do with the film. The film was not always called Blade Runner. Hampton Fancher's drafts were titled Dangerous Days. The term Blade Runner appears nowhere in Philip Dick's source novel. The title was borrowed, with payment, from a 1974 medical science fiction novel by Alan E. Nourse called The Blade Runner, about a man who smuggles black market surgical instruments. William S. Burroughs had adapted that novel into a never-filmed treatment he published under the same title. Scott liked the sound of the words. His producer obtained the rights from both Nourse and Burroughs. Neither Nourse's novel nor Burroughs' treatment shares a single story element, character, concept, or theme with the 1982 film. A Blade Runner in Nourse's world is a medical courier. A Blade Runner in Scott's world is a police officer who hunts synthetic humans. The connection is 2 words and a licensing fee. The single most famous title in science fiction cinema history is borrowed from a book about illegal surgery, adapted by the author of Naked Lunch, and has no narrative relationship whatsoever to the film that made it immortal. That is not trivia. It is a capsule summary of how Blade Runner came to exist, not through linear creative logic, but through lateral, accidental, borrowed material assembled into something that transcended every one of its origins. The man whose original text was borrowed and transformed had complicated feelings about all of it right up until the week he died. Number 2. Philip Dick called his own novel Road Runner, then saw 20 minutes of footage and wept. Philip Dick spent years watching Hollywood mishandle science fiction. When he first encountered the Blade Runner production, he was so dismissive that he refused to use the film's actual title. He called it Roadrunner. He attacked Hampton Fancher's early drafts in the Los Angeles press. He was suspicious, alienated, convinced the film would be another degradation of his life's work. In December 1981, Scott invited Dick to the Entertainment Effects Group facility for a private screening of a 20-minute effects reel. Not the finished film, not a rough cut, just the effects work assembled to music. Dick arrived in a limousine, reportedly in a foul mood. They screened the reel. The lights came up. Dick said nothing. Then he asked them to run it again. When the lights came up the second time, he turned to effects supervisor David Dreyer and said, "How is this possible? Those are not the exact images, but the texture and tone of the images I saw in my head when I was writing the original book. The environment is exactly as I'd imagined it." He died 4 months before the film's release. He had spent years convinced the production was destroying his work and spent his final months fully converted, writing to Warner Brothers executives that the film would prove invincible. His letter to the Ladd Company ended, "My life and creative work are justified and completed by Blade Runner." The film was dedicated to him. He never saw the finished version. The man whose interior world was captured more precisely on screen than he believed possible was gone before the curtain rose. And the man who refused to let his novel be absorbed into Hollywood machinery, that act of refusal is the bonus fact. Number 1. The director who built Dick's world most faithfully had never fully read the book. This is the foundational fact of the entire production. Ridley Scott joined the project in February 1980, driven partly by grief. His older brother Frank had recently died, and he wanted immersion in fast, consuming work. He did not arrive as a devotee of Philip Dick. He arrived as a director looking for a visual world to inhabit. Scott never fully read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? David Peoples, the screenwriter brought in to replace Hampton Fancher, confirmed it directly. Scott's engagement throughout the scripting process was total, but it was with the screenplay as a visual document, not with the novel as a philosophical one. The film's departure from Dick's source material, the elimination of the empathy boxes, the Mercerism religion, the entire ethical infrastructure of Dick's world, was not the result of fully considered adaptation decisions. Some of it was removed by a director who hadn't read far enough into the text to know it was there. And yet, the 20 minutes of footage that made Philip Dick weep, that reproduced the texture and tone of his interior world more precisely than he thought possible, was built by a man who hadn't read the book. Scott understood something about the emotional register of Dick's vision through the screenplay alone, through his own visual instinct, through his background as a painter. He built the right world by an entirely unauthorized route. The film that defined Dick's legacy was made by a director who reached its essence without going through the front door. That is not a failure of fidelity. It is the most Dickian thing imaginable, a copy that captures something the original hadn't fully articulated yet. Number 0. Philip Dick refused for $100,000 to write the novelization, and that refusal is why you know his name. The studio approached Dick with a standard Hollywood offer: write the official novelization of the film. The fee was $400,000. in 1982 dollars. For a science fiction writer who had spent decades in financial precarity, publishing dozens of novels that reached cult audiences but rarely commercial ones, $400,000 was not a routine offer to decline. Dick declined it. His refusal rested on a principle that sounds simple and was actually radical. The film was based on his novel. The novel already existed. To write a novelization of the film would be to produce a copy of an adaptation of his own original work, to subordinate the thing that existed first to the thing that existed second. The studio was furious. Dick held firm. He demanded instead that Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep be re-released as a tie-in with the film's poster on the cover. That insistence on the primacy of the original, on his own authorship not being subordinated to Hollywood's commercial machinery, is the reason Philip Dick's literary reputation survived the film. Readers who came to Blade Runner and were pointed back to the novel found a different and equally remarkable work. They found an author, not a tie-in product. A man who had spent decades asking the same questions the film was asking in a different and sometimes more precise form. The $400,000 Philip Dick refused may be the most valuable act of artistic self-respect in science fiction publishing history. Without that refusal, the film consumes the book. With it, the book survives the film, and Dick survives his own legacy. Blade Runner cost $30 million. It made $27,600,000 domestically in its original run. It was fired from by telegram, soaked in rain machine, water, and professional contempt, stripped of its preferred ending, fitted with a voiceover, its star hated, and its director repudiated, and released into a summer that E.T. had already claimed. 7 versions exist. The debate about which one is the film has never been resolved. The argument about whether Deckard is human has never been resolved. The question of whether the best science fiction film of its era is the theatrical cut its director despised, or the director's cut its audiences waited a decade for, remains an annual argument. Roy Batty's 42 words are not lost in time. They have been quoted at funerals, tattooed on bodies, sampled in music, referenced by Nobel laureates, and spoken over graves by people who never saw the film until long after the theater run that barely broke even. They were written in a hotel room the night before filming, delivered by a Dutch actor on a cold backlot in Burbank while crew members wept. The rain machine was still running. The future was being built in the dark. If this changed how you see the film, drop it in the comments. Share it with someone who only knows the director's cut. Subscribe, because we're here every week in the archive, finding what the legend buried. It's not that they built the future. It's that the future survived everything they did to each other while building it.